Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Dear my students, welcome to a new lecture in our course Critical Thinking. Today, inshallah, we will complete chapter 3 with the critical thinking skills. And this is lecture 5, and I am Dr. Hamid Said. We dealt with the critical thinking skills before, and we defined the critical thinking skills as the skill which is used to verify a certain issue, to resolve a contradiction, to reach a conclusion, to take a decision, or even to solve a problem. So the critical thinking is usually oriented to do something which is useful to the human beings, just to resolve a contradiction, to reach a conclusion, to take a decision, or even to solve a problem. This is simply what's meant by the critical thinking skill. And as you know, there are several critical thinking skills. And today in this lecture, we will deal with some of these skills. Let's start with the first one. This is the ability to distinguish between facts and opinions. So you have to be completely familiar with what's meant by facts and what's meant by opinions. And how can you distinguish between facts in our life or even opinions? In general, the fact is a thing that is known or proved to be true. So when we have something which is proved to be true, so this may be a fact. Whereas the opinion is a view or judgment formed about something, but not necessarily based on fact or knowledge. So the proven things can be facts, but opinions is not proven yet. Opinion is just judgment, is just something subjective, while the fact is something objective, as will be dealt with in the comparison afterwards. Also, we can say that opinions are not of value in supporting proof and evidence unless they are based on information. So we cannot use our subjective opinions or ideas, which are just subjective and judgment of ourselves, to support or to back proof or evidence unless these opinions are based on information. Opinions are of value in formulating and assessing an individual thinking. We can assess or formulate one's thinking using his opinions, but they are still opinions, they are not facts. This is very important concerning the difference between opinions, which are subjective, they are not proven yet, and the facts which are proven and they are objective. So we can have this table to compare in more details between facts and opinions. For example, facts are based on the experiences of many people, while opinions are based on some individuals' experience. The majority of people adopt facts, but the majority of people do not adopt the same opinions. So, facts are based on the experience of many people, while opinions are based on some individuals only. At the same time, limited number of people do not accept the truth, while a big number of people do not agree with opinions. So the truth or the factual things are acceptable by a great deal of people, while the opinions are adopted or accepted by only few people. The facts only include or can include numerical information and the specific examples, while opinions are just unproven generalizations, and they are subjective, as we stated before. The facts, something established or settled because they happened or were found in the past. So they are agreed upon, they are established, they are settled in the minds of people. While opinions can probably happen in the future or may have happened in the past. So this is very important because facts are well established, agreed upon, settled because they happened or were established in the past, years ago or even decades ago. While the opinions are just unproven things, may happen in the future or even may have happened in the past. Next, for example, let's take some examples for facts and opinions to be able to distinguish between both of them. When we say, for example, here, the summation of the three angles of a triangle is 180 degrees. We can say this is a mathematical or geometrical fact because it is established, it is settled, it is agreed upon by the mathematician and the scientists. So this is a piece of fact here. While when you say private schools are better than governmental ones, this is just opinion. Why? Because you may see that private schools are better, while I see that governmental schools are better. So there is a difference between the fact here, which is settled and agreed upon by all people, and the opinions which differ from one to another one. Another example for fact, something like carbon dioxide is heavier than O2. Carbon dioxide is heavier than oxygen. Yes, okay. So this is scientific fact. It is settled, it is established, it is agreed upon by the scientists all over the world. But when we say studying mathematics, for example, is more enjoyable than studying English, this is just subjective opinion. So who is saying that? I may say that studying math is more enjoyable than studying English, but another one may say that studying English is more enjoyable. So this is something subjective, so this is just opinion. When we say the red color is a hot color, so this is a fact or a piece of fact because this is agreed upon by the scientists that the red color is a hot color. It is not a cold color. But when you say orange color is better than letter color, so this is just opinion because you may prefer orange, but I do prefer red to orange. So this will vary according to the preferences of people. So, and when things vary according to the preferences and judgment of people, so these are just opinions, they are not facts, in fact. When we say too, plants need water to live. Plants need water to live because this is a piece of fact. Because all the science, even all the people agree that all plants need water to live. So this is fact. But when we say the party was boring, the party was boring, boring to me or to him, to her, to them, etc. This will vary a lot according to the subject or according to the people. So this is fact while these are opinion. Okay, the next skill of critical thinking is to be able to identify and assess assumptions. How to identify that this is just assumption and how to assess the strength of these assumptions. So let's identify first what's meant by assumptions. An assumption is something accepted, believed, or assumed to be true. Take care here. It is accepted or believed or even assumed to be true. but it may be true, it may be wrong. It may be true, it may be false, but it is assumed by someone or accepted by someone or even believed by someone to be true. But it may be true or it may not be true. So this is an assumption. So even we can define assumption as an an unexamined belief. When you have some kind of belief and you haven't yet examined this belief, so it is still an assumption. So an assumption is an unexamined belief. We can also say that an assumption is something that argument takes for granted in reaching a conclusion. So sometime when we are arguing with each other, someone may take something, a premise for example, for granted. It means he assumes that this premise is true. Then he moved to the conclusion directly and based this conclusion upon this assumption. And this is completely wrong. We cannot we cannot correctly base our conclusions on just assumptions until we examine these assumptions, whether they are true, whether they are false. We can also say that assumptions are usually used to make inferences or to make conclusion because we base our inferences and our conclusion upon the assumptions. The ability to identify and assess assumptions is very essential to critical thinking. And this is very, very, very high ability just to be able to identify whether this is assumption, whether this is a factual thing, or even to assess this assumption in everyday life or even in the argument during arguing. So, what are the critical questions we can ask about assumption to be able to identify assumptions and to assess assumption? The first question we have to ask ourselves is, what am I taking for granted here? What am I taking for granted here? The next question is, am I assuming something I shouldn't? I assume something, but I shouldn't assume this. Okay, so because it is just an examined assumption. The third question is, how can I determine whether this assumption is accurate? Is it accurate or inaccurate? The next question is, what is the author assuming? Suppose we are reading a text, a story, a piece of news or information. Suppose we are even looking for information on the web. So the author himself is assuming something. Can we detect the assumption and can we identify these assumptions and can we assess these assumptions whether they are true or false? The last question is, how can I determine if these authored assumptions are accurate or inaccurate? So before believing in assumption and before adopting the assumptions in any arguing situation, we have to determine if these assumptions are accurate, if these assumptions are true or false. So we have in this context some tips and pieces of advice to identify assumption. First of all, our inferences or conclusions are often based on assumptions that we haven't thought about critically. So the advice is we have to think about our assumption critically before adopting them as premises for inferences or for conclusion. The second tip is a critical thinker, however, is attentive to these assumptions because they are something incorrect or misguided. I mean, there is a difference between the critical thinker and the ordinary human because the critical thinker always take everything critically because he usually analyze, he usually criticize, judge, etc. So a critical thinker should be attentive to these assumptions because they may be correct or even incorrect or even misguided. Just because we assume something is true does not mean it is. This is a very important tip and very important rule. Believing that something is true doesn't mean it is actually true. Believing that something is wrong doesn't mean necessarily that it is wrong. So, in a way, we have to criticize, we have to examine and check our assumptions before judging them finally. And number four, you have to think carefully about your assumptions when finding and analyzing information. When you are searching for information on the web, for example, or in a given book or even encyclopedia, when you are listening to someone as a source of knowledge or information, you have to be careful about these assumptions when finding and analyzing these information. Number five of the tips to identify assumptions, you have to think carefully about the assumptions of others. So we have to examine our assumptions first and to examine the others' assumptions. Number six, whether you are looking at, listening to, or watching any source, I mean any source of information, we should always consider the author's assumption because as we will deal afterwards, there are many types of assumption. There is something called explicit assumptions and implicit or implied assumptions and something called background assumptions. So you have to be very attentive and very aware of the author's assumptions, and you have to be skillful at identifying and searching for the author's assumption within his source, I mean his book, his writing, his story, etc. Number seven, we have to ask a question: are the author's conclusions based on critically examined assumption or roughly based on assumptions which are not examined, okay, which are not proven? So we have to ask this question: are the source conclusion based on critically examined assumption or just unproven assumptions? Dear my students, let's move now to classify in less details the types of assumptions. Assumptions can be classified into explicit assumptions. This is clear assumptions because they are stated in the phrases or on the text, on the speech of the author or the speaker. So they are explicit because they are stated. Or even implicit assumptions. They are implicit because they are unclear, because they are implied, they are between lines. You can examine this with some kind of difficulty. Why? Because they are implicit, because they are implied between the lines of the story or the lines of the book or the lines of the piece of information, etc. So the first one is the explicit or clear assumption, which are stated by the author or the source, and the implicit assumptions, which are implied between the lines. We have also something else called the background assumptions. The background assumptions are deeply embedded and rooted inside inside our characters, inside our minds, because these background assumptions are adopted by everyone in his way of life, in everyday life, in his beliefs, in his expectations of others' behavior, etc. So this is something deeply embedded and deeply rooted in our characters, in our minds, etc. To conclude, assumptions can be clear, this is explicit, unclear, implicit, or even deeply embedded in our characters and our minds, and these are the background assumptions. Now, dear students, let's have some assumptions to be able to identify them and to distinguish and examine them. When somebody says, I heard a scratch at the door, I got up to let the cat in. Take care of this phrase. I heard a scratch at the door. This is the first statement. He heard a scratch at the door. So, what are the assumptions inside his mind upon which he decided to get up to let the cat in? I think if we examine these statements together, we can detect some assumptions. The first one is the, the cat is the only thing to make a scratch at the door. The second assumption, the cat makes a scratch on the door to be let in. Yes, take care here. These are assumptions which are assumed by the speaker of these statements, but you can notice that these assumptions are not stated in the wording here, in the words of these phrases, but they are implicit because they are implied, because they are unclear. You have to examine the situation and to examine the words carefully to be able to detect these implicit assumptions. So this is an example of the implicit assumptions here. So you have to be skillful at identifying, examining the phrases, examining the wording, for example, to identify and assess the assumptions. Another example here, when somebody says, I will graduate next June from university. I will graduate next June from university. This person assumes that he or she, take care here, live until next June. Number two, remain at university until June. Number three, attend all the exams. And number four, succeed in all the exams. All these assumptions are adopted or assumed by the speaker here because he said, I will graduate next June from university. So he will live until next June, first assumption. He will remain at university, not to leave university until June. Number three, he will attend all the exams. He will not miss any of them. And he guarantees that he will succeed in all the exams. All of these assumptions are adopted or assumed by this speaker. And all of these, by the way, are implicit or unclear assumptions the same way. Another example of assumptions. When we read the following warning sign on the road, for example, you are traveling on the highway or a particular road and you noticed this sign, drive your car carefully on the road. Take care here. Drive your car carefully on the road. So, what are the assumptions behind these sign? I mean, what are the assumptions assumed by the party or the authority which wrote these sign? This sign assumed that there are many dangers which can face you when driving on this road. This is sure. So the skill here is how to distinguish between the true and the false assumptions. Let's have new example of assumptions. When your father advises you saying, drive your car carefully on the road, take care here. It is the same as the previous sign here. Drive your car carefully on the road. So here the speaker is not an authority, but here this is your father. He advises you saying, drive your car carefully on the road. The assumptions may be different. These may be, there may be many dangers on the road. There may be something wrong with your car, or even simply your father is worried about you. All of these assumption, assumptions can be adopted here. Why? Because the situation is different. Because this is your father. He is not the government, for example. Okay? So the assumptions may vary or even differ. I mean, identifying the assumptions will differ according to the situation, according to the speaker, according to the source, according to the background of the source or the background of the speaker. All of these affect the identification and the assessing of the assumptions. Let's have an activity here. Consider the situation, then respond to the questions. Someone is called Bill, needs 6 scholarly articles for his paper on the psychological effects of domestic violence. Take care here. He needs 6 articles. On what? On the subject of psychological effects of domestic violence. He searches Google, for example, for psychological effects of domestic violence. He looks through the first few hits and finds 6 sources, including some articles on the websites of legitimate organizations. A few of these articles include bibliographies. So, the conclusion of Bill's or the inference of Bill's here is I'm gonna to stop researching because I have my 6 sources, simply because he's searching for only 6 articles and he found them, so he has to stop researching because he has or because he had his 6 sources. But is this conclusion correct? Is it right? So our questions here for this activity is, do you agree with the conclusion? Why? If you agree, and why not if you don't agree? Question number 2. What assumptions may have led to the conclusions? It means what are the assumptions adopted by Bill which lead him to this conclusion, to this decision to stop researching? Question number 3. What are some alternative ways of thinking about this situation? How can we manage this situation? Suppose you were instead of Bill, I mean. So, what are the alternatives to adopt here? So, this is an activity. Try it and give me feedback. Let's now move to another part or another skill of the critical thinking skills. This skill is called distinguishing between true and false inference, true and false inference or conclusion. But first of all, as we stated before, an argument consists of premises that are intended to support or justify the conclusion. As we stated before, the conclusion of an argument is completely based upon the premises. And this argument may be valid or invalid. But what about validity and invalidity of the argument? An argument may be sound or unsound. So, what's meant by sound or unsound, or true and false? Inference or concluding means drawing the conclusions from the premises. So, when we are arguing, so we draw or derive the conclusions from the premises as stated before. So, this process is called inference or concluding. Okay? So, next, what about the validity and soundness of an argument? Because the argument may be valid or invalid, it may be sound or unsound. We state here that an argument is valid if and only if it takes a form that makes it impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion nevertheless to be false. Otherwise, it is invalid. And the or or a deductive argument is sound if and only if it is both valid and all of its premises are actually true. Otherwise, it is unsound. Let's rephrase these definitions again. We can say that an argument is valid if and only if the truth of the premises logically guarantees the truth of the conclusion. I mean, if premise one is true and the premise two is true, then the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. In this case, the argument is called as valid argument. And the argument is sound if and only if it is valid and their premises are actually true. So here, an argument is sound if and only if it is valid. So validity is a necessary condition for soundness here, and their premises are actually true. Let's here discuss this point by taking some examples. For example, when we say every human will die, this is premise 1. Ali is a human, this is premise 2. The conclusion is Ali will die. These three propositions compromise the argument here, the deductive argument. This is called the premise 1, premise 2, and this is a conclusion. Again, this every human will die. Ali is a human. Ali will die. So, this is valid and sound deductive argument. Why is it valid? Because the truth of the two premises guarantees the truth of this conclusion. Again, because the truth of these two premises guarantees the truth of this conclusion. And why is it sound? Because every human will die, this is true. Ali is human, this is true. So when the premises are true and the argument as a whole is valid, so this is sound argument. Please pay attention to this part because it is very important. So let's move to a valid argument but unsound one. So when we say every cat has a tail, Mona is a cat, Mona has a tail, we can say that this argument is valid. Why? Because if this is true and that is true, then the conclusion is true. I mean, the truth of the premises will lead to the truth or will guarantee the truth of the conclusion. But let's examine again these premises. Every cat has a tail. Yes, this is true. Mona is a cat. This is false. Why? Because Mona here is a human being. So we have one premise, the first one, which is true, and the second one is false. And because one of them is false, so this argument is unsound. Why is it unsound? Because one of its premises is not true. To be sound, both premises must be true and the argument as a whole must be valid. And we stated that validity means that the truth of the two premises leads to or guarantees the truth of the conclusion. Okay, my students, let's move to another example. This is valid and sound deductive argument. We have to examine this argument and to decide why is it valid and why is it sound. When we say in premise 1 all tigers are mammals, in premise 2, this is premise 2 by the way, no mammals are creatures with scales. Take care here. All tigers are mammals. No mammals are creatures with scales. Therefore, in the conclusion, no tigers are creatures with scales. This argument is valid. Why? Because the truth of these premises will lead to the truth of the conclusion. But what about soundness here? Let's examine the truth of each premise. All tigers are mammals. This is true. No mammals are creatures with a scale. This is true. And because the argument as a whole is valid and the two premises are true, therefore the argument is sound at the same time. Another example. Let's have a valid but unsound deductive argument. When we say all toasters are items made of gold, all items made of gold are time travel devices. Take care here. Therefore, all toasters are time travel devices. This argument is valid. Why? Because the truth of these premises will lead to the truth of this conclusion. But let's examine the truth of each of them. All toasters are items made of gold. This is false. This is not true. All items made of gold are time travel devices. This is false. So both premises are false. They are not true. So this argument is unsound, although it is valid one. So let's try another arguments. When we say group A students have high IQ, group A students always get high marks. The conclusion is there is a correlation between IQ and achievement. This argument is not sound because we do not have a complete correlation using a reliable study to prove that there is a correlation between IQ and achievement. When we say we cut off the frog's legs, this is premise 1. It couldn't jump when we said jump. This is premise 2. The conclusion, it lost the hearing organ. This is a conclusion. But this is false conclusion because it couldn't jump because it lost its legs, not because it lost the hearing organ. This is very important. Let's move to something called reasoning. And reasoning means using the mind in arguing. And when we are thinking and using mind in arguing, we may be inductive or even deductive. So we have to differentiate between two approaches in thinking and reasoning. The first one is induction, and the second one is deduction. In the case of induction, we move from part to whole, and we take events and they make generalizations. But in case of the deduction, we move from the whole to the part to arrive at a specific conclusion based on generalization. So they are opposite to each other, induction and deduction. Let's have another illustration like this. We usually move from general principles to specific instances in case of the deductive thinking. But in case of the inductive, we move from the specific instances to the general principles. So this is the whole and this is the specific. When moving from the specific to the general, this is induction. When moving from the general to the specific, this is deduction. And this is clear too in this illustration. In case of deduction, we move from generalizations to specific cases. And in case of deduction, we move from specific cases to the generalities or generalization. Also, it is very clear here. In case of the deduction, we start with the theory, the law, or the general principle to have hypothesis, observation, then to confirm here. So are moving from the whole or from the general things or the general principles to the confirmation in case of the specific things. So this is deduction. But in case of induction, we usually start with observation. I mean, we usually observe phenomena, we observe things in specific cases or specific individuals. And we are trying to collect these observations to create a pattern. And after that, we adopt this pattern to create a tentative hypothesis. And this tentative hypothesis may lead to a theory. So in case of induction, we start with observation and end with theory. But in case of deduction, we start with theory and end with the confirmation. This is very important. So let's now differentiate between the deductive and the inductive argument after examining the difference between deduction and induction. In case of the induction or inductive argument, one at first examines the presence of a given property in the part in order to reach a general rule governing the whole. I mean, we move from the part to the whole and from the specific to the general. But in case of the deductive argument, we arrive at a specific conclusion based on generalizations. I mean, we move from the whole to the part and from the general to the specific. In a valid deductive argument, the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. And this is the validity of the deductive argument as stated before. But in case of the inductive argument, the truth of the premises do not the truth of the premises does not guarantee the conclusion, but it only provides some degree of support for the conclusion. But it is possible to have true premises and false conclusion. Take care here. There is difference between the deductive argument and the inductive argument. In case of the deductive argument, if the argument is valid, then the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. Or the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion means the validity of this argument. But in case of the inductive argument, the truth of the premises provides some degree of support. Some degree of support. It means that it does not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Why? Because it is possible to have true premises and the false conclusion here. But in case of the deductive argument, the valid deductive argument, if the premises are true, then the conclusion is therefore true too. So we can classify the induction into different classes. Number one, according to the soundness, because we may have sound or true or unsound or false inductive arguments. And according to the comprehensiveness, we may have universal induction or even particular induction. But what's meant by these? The induction that is based on facts, not on opinions, is called sound induction. So the induction which is based on facts, not only opinions, is called the sound induction. For example, when we say iron is a metal, it expands by heating. Copper is a metal, it expands by heating. So what's meant by sound induction? The sound induction is based on facts, not on opinions. For example, when we say in premise 1, iron is a metal, it expands by heating. Copper is a metal, it expands by heating. Therefore, aluminum is a metal, it expands by heating. Therefore, metals expands by heating. Take care here. Iron is a metal, and at the same time it expands by heating. Copper is a metal, it expands by heating. Aluminium is a metal, it expands by heating. So all of these are metal, and all of them expand by heating. So this induction is based upon scientific basis, on facts. Why? Because iron is a metal, copper is a metal, aluminum is a metal. All of these are facts, scientific facts, and they all expand by heating, and these are scientific facts. So the conclusion here is sound. Why? Because metals expand by heating here. So there's a conclusion. So when we base our induction on facts, so the conclusion may be sound here. But the induction should be comprehensive in this case, because if it is only particular, the conclusion may not be sound like that. Let's start this example. Because the unsound induction, in this case, the induction is based upon opinions, not on facts. For example, when we say Ahmad is from Munufia, and I see that he is miser. Ali is from Munufia, and I see he is miser. Peter is from Munufia, and I see that he is miser. The conclusion is, my conclusion, all those who are from Menophi are miser. Is that correct? Is that sound? The answer is no. Why? Because here we based our induction upon opinions, not upon facts. What are the opinions here? When I say I see that he is miser, I see that he is miser, I see that he is miser. You see that he is miser, but the truth may be not like that. So in this example, the induction is based upon opinions, not on facts. So this is unsound induction. So this conclusion is unsound. What else? What about the universal induction and the particular induction? The universal induction is based on complete survey. Complete survey of each particular event or each particular individual of the society or the situation. So if you have a complete scan or complete survey of the situation or the society you are researching, then you may have universal induction. When we say student 1 succeeded, student 2 succeeded, student 3 succeeded, can we say student N succeeded? We cannot say this. Why? Because we only scanned and surveyed student number 1, student number 2, student number 3, but we cannot conclude that student number 30 or number 1000 succeeded. Why? Because this is not universal induction. It is a particular induction. We cannot say here that all students succeeded. We cannot say all students succeeded. Why? Because we surveyed only 3 students. But if we surveyed all the students and we found that all of them succeeded, we can say all students succeeded here. In this case, and only in this case, this will be universal induction or complete induction. Why? Because it is based upon complete survey. So we cannot say here all students succeeded like that. Now what about the particular induction? The particular induction is based on incomplete survey. Why? Because the universal or comprehensive induction is based upon complete survey. So the particular one is based on incomplete survey. Let's have this example again. Iron is a metal and is attracted to magnet. Cobalt is a metal and is attracted to magnet. Nickel is a metal and is attracted to magnet. Can we conclude that metals are attracted to magnet? All metals are attracted to magnets? We cannot say that. Why? Because this induction is particular. It is based on incomplete survey. Why? Because we haven't surveyed all the metals. We surveyed only iron, cobalt, and nickel. And this is scientific fact, as you know, because we have something called magnetic metals, which are attracted to magnet, and non-magnetic metals, which are not attracted to magnets. We cannot conclude that metals are or all metals are attracted to magnet. So take care when you are using the induction or the inductive argument. Take care and consider your induction whether it is particular or universal or comprehensive. So the particular induction, as we stated, is based on incomplete survey. When we say, for example, Ahmed is Egyptian and he is generous. Hassan is Egyptian and he is generous. Peter is Egyptian and he is generous. Can we conclude that all Egyptians are generous? We cannot say that. Why? Because this is partially accepted. Why? Because this is based upon particular induction here, because we haven't surveyed all the Egyptians. If we surveyed all the Egyptians, we can conclude that all Egyptians, in the literal meaning of the word all, are generous here. So we have to build or base our conclusions upon comprehensive or complete survey or complete induction, not particular one here. The next skill of critical thinking to be dealt with here is interpretation. And interpretation is a very important skill of the critical thinking skills. But first of all, what's meant by interpretation? You are interpreting something, you are interpreting situation, phenomenon, etc. It means the ability to explain the real reasons of a certain phenomenon. When you are able to explain and find out the real reasons or causes of something, so you are interpreting this thing. For example, the interpretation is the answer for questions such as what are the reasons or the causes of this? Why does this occur? How does this happen? What happens? What is behind this phenomenon? Can you explain this, please? All of these are related to the process or the thinking skill of interpretation. So when you are going to answer these questions, so you are interpreting the situation or you are interpreting the process or the phenomena, etc. Let's have an example. You know carbon dioxide, and as you know, carbon dioxide is used to extinguish fire. It is commonly used for this purpose. But we have here a fact, which is carbon dioxide as a gas does not combust nor support the combustion of other materials. This is a scientific fact. Carbon dioxide does not combust nor support the combustion of other materials. The question here is, the question will come afterwards, but here, therefore, carbon dioxide is used to extinguish fire. So, carbon dioxide fire extinguish fire by taking away the oxygen element of the fire triangle. So, we use it to extinguish fire because it does not combust nor support the combustion of other material. So, this is concerning carbon dioxide. But what about nitrogen, N2? The fact is, nitrogen 2 does not combust nor support the combustion of other materials. Yes, this is true, this is scientific fact. The same as carbon dioxide, nitrogen does not combust nor support the combustion of other materials. And the question is, can we use nitrogen instead of carbon dioxide in fire extinguisher? Can we use it for this purpose? This is the question. They are the same in this property that they don't combust nor support the combustion of other materials. But can we actually use nitrogen instead of carbon dioxide in fire extinguisher? This is a question you have to try to collect data and information about nitrogen and the carbon dioxide properties concerning the physical and chemical properties, and to try to analyze these data and information and to try to interpret if we can use nitrogen or we cannot use it. Why and why not? This is another assignment or activity. Try to solve it and give me a feedback, please. The next skill of critical thinking skills is the argument evaluation. Can we evaluate the argument? Can we assess and examine it effectively? So the ability to perceive the important aspects of that directly relate to the case or problem and pass judgment and distinguish between weaknesses and strengths. This is this is the meaning of argument evaluation. So when we are gonna to evaluate an argument, so we are trying to perceive the aspects related to this situation or this case. We are trying to pass judgment. We are trying to distinguish between the weaknesses, the weakness points, and the strength point of this situation of this or this point. There's something called argumentation. Argumentation, this is the process of arguing. Argumentation. And when we are going to argue with or against pro or against an idea or an opinion, we may be with pro or against this point or idea. But first of all, what's meant by argumentation here? Argumentation as a process is a very logical way of discussing or debating an idea. So, this process is very important because we are proving something to be true or false. We are arguing for or against for the sake of proving whether it is true or false. Even we can define argumentation as a discussion in which reasons are advanced for or against some proposition or some proposal. So this discussion or the process which is used in this discussion is called argumentation. What are other words for argumentation? We may name this or call this as argument, debate, line of reasoning, disputation, reasoning, dispute, discussion, logical argument, logic, etc. So we have different and various names of the process of argumentation. In case of arguing with others, we may validate an opinion or an idea, or we may refute or make something called rebuttal or disproof of this idea. So we have both sides, and these sides are extreme. What the first one is called validation. This is the act of determining that something, some idea, some opinion, etc., is true. So when we are proving that something is true, this is called validation, or supporting this idea, or defending that it is true. And when you are determining something as false, this is called refutation. So refutation, which is called also rebuttal or disproof, this is the act of determining something is false. And refutations pop up often in law debates and philosophical arguments. So we have two extremes, just to be prove something and we are trying to prove it, to prove that it is true or to prove that is false. This is called validation. The next is called refutation or rebuttal or disproof. So when analyzing any argument, we have to ask some questions. Something like, are the terms used clearly and applied consistently? Is the proposition presented in a clear and direct way? Are facts presented as evidence? Is the inference logically correct? Is there any opposing arguments? What are the tools of persuasion or even validation? This is the end of our lectures. We tackled the different skills of critical thinking. For any questions, try to ask any question through the chat or even through any communication channel. To see you next lecture, inshallah. I advise you, before trying to change the world, just you would better change yourself before trying to change the world. Until see you, thank you very much and have a nice